Data validation is important in any web application. Here is an example of validation that would be used in the model class of a CakePHP application. This is a modified version of the complex example that CakePHP has on their website. At first glance, it might be overwhelming, but we are going to go over all of the necessary information so we can make similar validation rules for our own web application. To start out, we will have a validation array that we will set in our model. That variable name is validate. So for example, in our model, we would set the variable public validate, and then it will equal an array. The array is an associated array with a key value pair. The key will be equal to the field name in the table in the database. The value will be equal to the rule name, which indicates the type of validation that will be performed. The rule name is a predefined string. There's a list of core validation rules that you can find on the CakePHP website. For example, we would set public validate and then our array, where our key is the field name in our table in the database, and the value is the validation rule that we will be using, in this case, email. The validation options, or rule names, are the rules that we use to validate our data. I'm not going to cover the complete list of validation options that CakePHP has, but I will cover some of the commonly used validation rules. First is the alphanumeric. This checks to make sure only alphabet characters or integers are in the field. Between will give you a range of values. Date will check the date format. Email will check the email format. Max length will check the max length of a value. And in contrast is the min length, which will check the minimum length of a value. Not empty. This checks to make sure that there is some type of value in the field, no matter what it is. Numeric will check to make sure that the value is only integers. Each of those rule validations can have its own array of information. This allows for better control over each field that you want to validate. When using this array, there are only 5 keys in the associated array that can be used. Those are rule, required, allow empty, on, and message. Here's an example of how you would set this up in the validate array. We have our validate variable set to an associated array, and that key is the field name in the database, and that is set to an associated array with the 5 keys for further validation rules on that particular field. Let's go over the 5 keys that we can use. First is the rule key. This is set to the name of the rule you'll be using. If you're using this detailed associated array, you must have this rule set. If it isn't set, the validation will not be performed on that particular field. The second is required. This can have 4 different options. First, you can have true or false. This makes sure that the field is present in the data array. You can also use create and update. It performs the same exact task as if you were using true or false, but it's doing this on the create or update of the save. Next, we have the allow empty. This takes a true or false value. If it is set to false, the field must have some data present. Now again, this differs in that the required makes sure the data key is in the data array, not that there's data in that particular field. The on key takes 2 options. It either can be update or create. This allows for certain validation to be performed if the entry is being created or updated. If you don't set the on to being update or create, it defaults to null, and this means that the validation will be performed on both update and create. Last is the message key. This is a custom validation message that can be set where it will be displayed for the user to see. This is the exact same data validation that I showed you at the beginning of this segment. Let's walk through this validation and we should have a pretty good understanding of what's going on. Here we are first validating the login field from the database. The rule that's being used with the login field is alphanumeric. It's also required, and it has a personal message for the user to see if the validation is not met. The password field in the database is validated by the rule minimum length. The minimum length is set to 8 characters, and there's also a personalized message for the user to see if the validation is not met. The email field in the database is being validated by email. There's no other validation requisites set for the email field. The last field in the database to be validated is the born field. The validation rule being used is date. This means that the contents of the field must be in a date format. There's also a personalized message set if the validation rules are not met. Lastly, the allow empty is set to true. Even though the validation at first glance seemed complex, once we broke it down, the validation for form data became very straightforward and relatively easy to understand. We can now take our new knowledge of form validation and apply it to our web application.